But first, plain packaging on cigarettes and roll-your-own tobacco and a change in the tax laws that made cheaper brands more expensive have led to a sharp drop in sales in the UK. That's the finding of academic research that is the first in the world to use detailed shopping data to track the impact of plain packaging on tobacco sales. Here in the UK, plain or standardised packs came in 2016. We were the second country to give it a try. Australia was first. The tobacco industry had claimed that plain packaging would have no impact on cigarette sales. In fact, they fell by 12 million a month. Dr. Rosemary Hiscock led the study. She's from the Tobacco Control Research Group at the University of Bath.
We compared the 10 months before standardised packaging and the 10 months in the year after standardised packaging, and we found that the sales decline was faster in the year afterwards than it was before.
What does that translate into then, that decline you saw in terms of, the number of cigarettes sold?
Well, the revenue for tobacco firms declined by 13% after standardised packaging, and this means that people have more money in their pockets to pay for other things rather than towards a deadly addiction.
Tobacco sales were already falling when this plain packaging was forced on tobacco companies. People had started switching to vaping because that was cheaper and less damaging to health. One of our listeners, Matt Gibbs, did that last year. He's from Worcestershire. Here he is.
I smoked about 20 roll-ups a day, probably from when I was about 17, 18. All the lads at work went on to the vapes, and it seemed like a good idea, and it's worked out pretty well. I'm still on it now, and I feel a lot better for it. I feel generally just a bit fitter, don't just think of fags all the time. I suppose part of it's the cost, but a lot of people switch from smoking tailor-made cigarettes to roll-ups because they're considerably cheaper. Most people I know that still smoke roll-ups, and they sell it in the 30-gram pouches these days, I think. I'm not sure what the cost is of those, but I imagine it's considerably less than a pack of 20. A pack of 20 is probably, 50 or 60% dearer than they were 7 or 8 years ago. But people's wages haven't gone up 50, 60%, have they, in the same amount of time?
That's our listener, Matt Gibbs. Dr. Rosemary Hiscock, that tax that was also brought in at the same time as plain packaging, how did that work and how does that affect pricing?
Well, it was a very specifically targeted tax towards the lowest price cigarettes, which keep young people smoking and allow them to buy it at low prices, and price conscious smokers because it's not too much money out of their pocket. With this particular tax, it discourages the tobacco companies from pricing their products low. So we could see with our data that when this minimum excise tax was brought in, that the prices of the lowest priced cigarettes did rise.
Does it apply to roll your own tobacco?
No, it doesn't, because the tax system works differently from roll your own tobacco, and roll your own tobacco sales were rising throughout the period that we studied. So that suggests that there should be more tax on roll your own in the future.
Because the price of vaping has gone up as the big tobacco companies have bought up some of the most popular vaping brands. And if those prices continue to rise, the worry is that vaping will start to cost more than smoking roll-ups and that vapers might switch back to smoking tobacco. Do you think that might happen?
I think because with vaping it still continues the addiction to nicotine, there's always that concern that it could lead to a relapse to tobacco, and that's the case that sometimes happens now, but sometimes people quit after vaping and sometimes people continue to vape, so it's a big mixed picture.
When you look at the decline in tobacco sales that you saw in your research and you put it against the numbers who are quitting smoking, is there any correlation there? Because another thing that happens is that poorer people who can less afford to pay the high price of cigarettes and roll-ups and so on, they buy smuggled-in cigarettes that are sold illegally that are a lot cheaper.
Yes, we had a look at the HMRC government figures on smuggled tobacco, and we found that the figures of the tax gap have been stable over the period, so it doesn't look like people have been turning to illicit tobacco.
What does this research tell us about why people give up tobacco? Is it health or is it price?
It can be for both reasons. Particularly for low-income people, price is a really important incentive for older people, once the health effects of smoking start to appear, that's when they often decide to quit.
That's Dr. Rosemary Hiscock from the University of Bath. She was speaking to me this morning. The government's told people not to go on cruises. It doesn't think they're safe. That'll make things a bit easier for the people who've booked cruises and don't want to go now. It means they'll be entitled to full refunds because their trips have been cancelled. But of course it's a huge blow for the industry.